Hello and welcome. My name is Susan. I am an artist and an art historian from Italy, and this is my full presentation that I gave at TerrorCamp 2022. It's titled The Language of Images, Visual Parallelism, Comparisons and Artworks referred to in AMC's The Terror Season 1. So in my presentation, I will try to explain why the diverse public of a TV show from 2018 can easily understand what its creators wanted to express in the scenes taken into consideration, even though they had no control, obviously, on who their works was going to reach. By presenting 10 different comparisons between artwork from art history and scenes from the show, I reflected on why these scenes have been visually constructed like that, why we perceive them in a positive way rather than a negative one, or vice versa, why that image visually constructed like that makes us feel joy, and why that other image gives us a sense of dread instead. Moreover, I explained why they reminded us of the artworks taken into consideration and how the creators have probably unconsciously modeled them on these images that are part of our shared visual alphabet, making it easy for the viewer to get the reference at once. So I analyzed each of these 10 scenes, taking into account their visual composition in order to show how an image can express a feeling or an idea, even when the viewer doesn't yet know where the story is going. I then explained why this is possible, why the viewers of a TV show or a movie or a play or any other kind of visual representation can understand exactly what emotions the characters are feeling, even with no spoken explanation. I also tried to explain how our vision has been shaped by visual conventions throughout time and how these scenes work, just like their creators intended them to work, explaining that the way we see, or better, the way that we have been taught to see, is the same for all of us, because we share the same background, the same past, the same unwritten rules about vision, which is why we don't understand what the images they presented are meant to mean. And the parallelism and connection I made here are obviously entirely my own. So this is just the index of what I'm going to show you. And basically, a biggest inspiration for my work comes from this guy. This guy's name is John Berger, and he was a writer and an art historian who studied vision in general and the way we see and the way we've taught to see. And he created this documentary for BBC called Ways of Seeing, and is saying that the process of seeing paintings or seeing anything else is less spontaneous and natural than what we tend to believe, and a large part of seeing depends upon habit and conventions. And something else that he also wrote in Ways of Seeing is that seeing comes before words. The child looks and recognizes before it can speak. So seeing is the very first thing that we do, and it's something we all do from the moment we first open our eyes to the last to the moment that we'll last close them for the very last time. So my first comparison that I'm going to take into consideration is comes from a promotional series. So it's actually out of the time of the TV show. So this is not a frame from the actual TV show, but it's from a promotional picture series that were released before the show was released. So every single image here in this series is not just a picture, but a portrait. The difference between the two is that a picture is a generic kind of image, whereas a portrait is a picture that tells you something about the people depicted, such as their social status, their current emotions, their ideas or beliefs, or something else. So this is the portrait of James Fitzjames, and this portrait is the most complex one in the series, which presents basically most of the main characters of the Terror, and is the most complex one in the series, and it differs from all the others, which are all very easy to connect to the characters they represent at first glance. So for example, we see a Crozier who is angrily yelling at the glass of ice behind which is trapped, and is desperately trying to free himself from it. And then we see Iki, who is calmly staring directly into the viewer's eyes, holding our gaze, and is clearly like plotting something that we yet cannot understand. And then we have Fitzjames, and it's almost hard to recognize him here. So he's wearing his full uniform, but there's nothing of the loud, self-centered man from the very first half of the series when he was, wearing his very shiny, perfect and pristine uniform. And that Fitzjames would have fixed us with a confident smirk. He would have taken some heroic poses, maybe, or he would have gazed assumedly into the distance, or something like that. While this Fitzjames, however, is more similar to the version from the second half of the series. So someone who is more thoughtful, honest, and even sensitive, so more open. But it's not just that. He is portrayed with his eyes closed and his hands joined in front of his chest, focused on something only he is seeing. So basically, he's deep in prayers. It's a peculiar choice for him, since Fitzjames surely was a religious man, even the actual Fitzjames. But that's not an aspect of him that it's an aspect of him that never gets fully and explicitly addressed in the show. And it's not one of the main features of his character, as it might be for Sir John or even Lieutenant Irving. So we never see Fitzjames pray during the entire series, not once. So why is he praying here? More so, what is he praying for? We don't know, and we have no mean to know. We can make up assumptions about it, and they will differ from each other, depending on the fact that we may or may not have already watched the entire series. But either way, we cannot know the reason with certainty. The most obvious reason for Fitzjames to pray would be for the eyes to release them, of course, so they could come back safely to England. But if that would have been the case, in my opinion, we would see a more determined Fitzjames with a different kind of expression on his face. He would be frowning, maybe, trying to find the best possible word to bring luck on their way, or he'd be crying even, too frightened and like desperate to hold up any kind of barrier anymore. But what we see here instead is a kind of openness on his face, as if he'd be accepting his fate, never mind how hard that could be. He's putting all of himself into the task of praying, and it doesn't even require him that much of an effort. He looks lost in it, so much that he doesn't even notice us. We're not part of this moment. He hasn't invited us in, which is very strange for someone like Fitzjames as well. So we are essentially spying on him, acting as viewers, because the only thing we can do is stare at him, being lost in his own private moment, and admire him, just like we would do with any other person who show a similar devotion and peaceful acceptance of their fate. So someone like martyrs, saints, and Madonnas in prayer even. And this is why Sassoferrato's artwork as a comparison. The two characters in these two images, their poses are obviously extremely similar, but it's Sassoferrato's softness and gentleness that Fitzjames' portrait is echoing the most. Sassoferrato was an Italian painter from the first half of the 17th century, deeply influenced by classical Renaissance artists like Raffaello and Perugino mostly, and their devotional subjects especially. From them, he was inspired to use elegant lines and soft forms, and he became a master in creating small-sized Madonnas for private devotion. So a picture, basically this big, that you would hang in your own room, in your own place, as an inspiration for you to get inspired as you would pray. And this Virgin in Prayer from the National Gallery of London is a perfect example of this genre. So Mary is painted in soft tones. She has delicate features, her gaze is lost somewhere, and her hands are softly joined in front of her chest, and she isn't even acknowledging us, absorbed completely in her own prayers. Basically, just like Fitzjames in this other image. They are both lost in their own moments, and we are spying on both of them, admiring their devotion from the outside. This iconographical choice for Fitzjames reveals a hidden side of him that the viewer only has a few chances to catch glimpses of during the TV show, but that we are granted to see here. This portrait invites us to look further and go beyond our first impression of this character, telling us that Fitzjames is not just a loud-mouthed, hyper-confident man from episode 1, but is also this honest man with hidden depths who we perceive as pure and almost innocent, and extremely conscious of himself too. The fact that he's so focused on the act of praying makes us perceive him as someone who's been given a hard task and is now in the process of accepting it, like a martyr with his own martyrdom, the Madonna being aware that she's going to lose her own son, and Christ with his own destiny. For the second comparison, I have another promotional picture from a different series this time depicting Dr. Henry Goodsir. So he's standing in front of us, portrayed almost fully down to his waist. His pose is relaxed and his spine is slightly arched to the side, and is looking at something out of frame. The most important thing about this image, as well as the painting by Giovan Battista Moroni that I compare it with, however, is the objects that the two characters are holding in their hands. Coincidentally, one of these objects is the same one in both images, and it's a pair of scissors. However, they are similar only in name, since the one Goodsir is holding is a surgeon type of scissor, while the one the man in Moroni's artwork is holding is clearly a tailor's type of scissor. Because it's more bulkier, it has a different shape, and we can immediately notice, even if we are not like professionals in either of these two areas, we can still notice that they're very different and what kind of jobs they reminded us. So why is this important? It is because the viewer can immediately understand who these people are, even at first glance, even without knowing their names or their stories, their backstories, and anything like that. We know that we are looking at a surgeon and at a tailor, or a surgeon or any kind of doctor, even if we are not like a super, if we don't know that much in the medical Victorian era field, we still know that this is a doctor that we're looking at. And it becomes even more evident when we notice the other objects that they are also holding in their hands. For Goodsir is the kind of case holding all of his surgical instruments, and in Moroni's artwork is a piece of fabric. So of course, they are once again objects placed there to express what this man's jobs are. Another detail that immediately tells us something about their occupations are the outfits. Goodsir is wearing the typical apron that surgeons from his era used to wear over their clothes, as well as the sleeves thing that the surgeons and doctors would put on their over their clothes to prevent getting dirty on their clothes. And Moroni, the man in Moroni's artwork, as his tailor, as he is wearing expensive and contemporary to Moroni clothes, those of a man who's successful and what he does and makes lots of money out of it. In both cases, this man's jobs are highlighted as one of the most prominent details of the portraits, which means that their jobs must have been an extremely important part of who they were, since both the photographer and the artist decided to explicitly focus on that. In Moroni's case, we don't know the actual name of the man depicted because this is the archetype of a tailor. So the artist is highlighting the tailor's role in society and the financial power that they can get thanks to it, rather than depicting just one specific tailor. In fact, we don't know the name of this man because that wasn't the artist's goal. In Goodsir's case, we know that this job is fundamental to his character's arc. He starts off as an anatomist who's still learning about his profession, but his status gets changed fairly soon by many other characters and throughout the entire show. He's a doctor in Graham Gore's eyes, for example, but he's a surgeon and a vital resource in Icky's plan later on. Goodsir is in love with the entire world, and that's why he decided to get into this field, to study and learn more about life and help people. It's ironic then that his job that he loves so much and the skills he has developed thanks to it are used against him in the end, of course, by Icky when he forces him to do what he had to do to Gibson's body, which is basically the second to last thing that Goodsir does before taking his own life. So in my point of view, that's basically what breaks him. And so this portrait is an anticipation to all of that, because we have been presented him with his job as the main feature of his character. Moreover, the surgeon's instrument that Nadav Kender, the photographer, has placed in Goodsir's hand are fundamental. We first see Goodsir using them to perform an autopsy on David Young's body in the very first episode of the series, but then is forced to use them later on again, first during Irving autopsy, and more importantly on Gibson's body, per Ickey's request, which is again what lastly breaks Goodsir, basically. So these instruments are a visual remark of how Goodsir is forced to change throughout the entire show by circumstances and by the hands of other people. However, if we look at Goodsir's portrait here and we focus on his facial expression, there is nothing of the pain that he's going to suffer later on, which means that he still doesn't know about it, or he does know about it and he accepts it. The Goodsir in the portrait looks mature, not as naive as he was in the first few episodes of the series. More so, his expression and posture resemble the one of a saint holding and showing his martyrdom instruments to the viewer, accepting his face, because his pose is open and his expression is also almost merciful, just like the typical martyr portrait in Western art history. The martyrs are always depicted with like holding their martyrdom instruments, so they dedicate their weapon that kill them, and this way they are easily recognizable to the viewer, and the viewer can almost like feel empathy, feel a sense of empathy for them, and like pray for them and feel closer to their pain. And for Goodsir, I think is the same, basically the same thing. And this portrait is a big anticipation of his entire story in the show. And after all, he's very close to a martyr because he consciously decided to sacrifice himself for a rightful reason and put an end to that chain of killings by killing himself, just like a martyr would do. For the third comparison, and actually, I have also another comparison with this artist, so Edward Hopper, compared to the same character, so Francis Crozier. So these two images are, even at first glance, extremely similar, both regarding the subject and the composition. They both depict a man sitting in his own, in a room on his own, staring at something in front of him with a tired, melancholic kind of air all around him. The scene of Crozier is in his cabin, is from episode 1, right after the moment where he registered the loss of David Young in Terror's log. So it's a hard moment for him, not just because one of his men passed, but also because Crozier is well aware that their situation in the Arctic is getting worse and worse by the minute. And no one else seems to really understand what's happening except for him, or at least that's what he feels. And we can see that he's clearly tired here, and not just in a physical way. He looks burdened by a worry bigger than him almost. And it's important also to mention that this very moment, this very shot, comes right before the flashback to the theater night that Crozier spent with Sophia and James Clark Ross back in England, which is clearly a time that he misses with two people that he misses and cherishes. And we understand that because the theater night, the scene in the theater night is full of light, full of warm light. So it's a very obvious contrast to this image, which is all darkness and cold colors. So Edward Hopper's artwork are a perfect visual translation for how Crozier feels for the first half of the series, especially. This is because Hopper is a master in depicting solitude and melancholia in the modern man, in the contemporary man especially. making these characters look like strangers in their own spaces, which is exactly how Crozier is portrayed in this scene. We can feel that something troubles him, that he feels lonely, misunderstood, and far away from the people who really know him. His loneliness is portrayed not just by him being the only person in the scene, but by visually imprisoning him into his own cabin's doorframe, like this, which is in turn imprisoned in the camera's frame. So basically, it's the same escamotage that Oppers also uses in his own painting, in this painting, which is titled Offices in a Small City. And they both had this frame within a frame trick, visual trick, and they are both telling us that these men are separated from us. They feel separated from everyone else, even the viewer, even an outside viewer, and they feel they are in a different space than what we are. They are basically unreachable. Maybe probably because they made themselves unreachable, especially in Crozier's case. And that's how they feel, at least. Caged into a space where they should feel safe, especially for Crozier. Crozier is in his own cabin. Not everyone in a ship used to have a cabin. If you had a cabin, it means you had a higher kind of level. For example, if you were a captain, you had your own cabin. So it should be a space that you cherish. And even the man in the office is probably not the loveliest place to be, but it should still be a good place to be. It shouldn't be like a threatening place. But instead, these two spaces for these two people that should be safe, they only act as a prison. And the stillness over both images is not a comforting calm, but more of a terrible, silent loneliness by which both characters are imprisoned in both cases. This is the other comparison between Crozier and Opper. And in this case, we are at for the terror scene, we are at the end of episode 4, after Icky's punishment, and right after Lieutenant Irving told Crozier that everyone but 10 men decided to leave terror in favor of Erebus. And this is basically the final slap in Crozier's face, because he was already feeling drained because of everything that's been happening up to that point, and then also Icky's punishment also happened, and then now this is what basically makes him really understand how truly hated he's made himself to be to every single man on both ships, which for someone in this situation is basically their own entire world. So this is how we see him after Lieutenant Irving had just told him that. We see him seated at this cabin, at this table in the great cabin, on his own once again, and in the darkness once again, just like the previous image. The Arctic, obviously, it's a dark place for its own nature, but putting a character in the darkness is still a visual choice. Crozier could have been surrounded by candles or lamps or some other kind of artificial light, for example, but he is not. By putting him in complete darkness, we are meant to feel how deeply isolated and alienated he is, so much that he hasn't even called for Jobson to light something up, a candle, a lamp, something else, nor did he try to do it himself. More obviously, he's in the darkness because he feels like he has lost his way, and he has lost his way into alcohol, in the Arctic, and with his men, and is now stumbling in the darkness. Edward Hopper's 4-lane road has this same kind of mood to it. Even if there is light in this picture, it's not a warm or comfortable light. And the main character in the scene, the man sitting on his own, just like Crozier, looks frozen in place. He doesn't even look scared or desperate, just like Crozier, because fear and despair are strong emotions. But they look more like alienated by the reality they're being forced to live in. And there is a feeling of resignation in both images. as if both men were crushed under life itself and won't ever be able to move again, almost. As per the composition, the scene from the show is constructed on the diagonal lines of the table and the cabin itself, which are like two arrows pointing to a goal. First of all, the diagonal lines are meant to give us a sense of either dynamism, which is not the case, or the other meanings they have usually is feeling like unbalanced. And we are unbalanced here because our point of view, so the camera point of view, so our eye, has been placed higher than normal. And we notice this because the table it looks like it's kind of sliding to us, like ready to shift closer to us. And I feel like this is to make us feel, unbalanced on our feet, just like Crozier is, because Crozier is drunk. And we know that he's drunk here, or that he's been drinking, because the two diagonals that are like arrows from for our gaze, they are pointing to the goal, to the focal point of the image, which is Crozier's right hand, and he's holding a drink in his right hand, which is the main focus again. And this is like making us notice this thing as the main important thing in this image. Also, everything is pretty dark in this picture. The only like two kind of points of light or less darkness are Crozier's face and his right hand. So it's basically the two things that we immediately notice. And noticing this is basically making us realize that he is in this situation, he is in the darkness, and he is alone, and he's depressed and tired and whatever. Why? Because he's drinking, because that's where our gaze points to when we see this picture, to the drink, to literally to his hand holding the drink. And in fact, the thing that he does right after this shot, when this moment of stillness kind of breaks, is drinking and finishing the drink. So basically, with just this picture, we understand all of this, just with this one image. The fifth comparison I have is for Iki. So we are still in episode 4 here, and this is like the scene before the one we just saw. So this is during Iki's punishment. This is the moment he just kind of survived the punishment and got up to his feet again. And it's in this picture, in this precise shot, that we see how much Iki has changed, or better, how much he feels changed by what just happened. Iki perceives himself as someone who has just endured a really demanding physical and mental effort and has survived it splendidly, because the person who did this to him, Crozier, has inflicted him more than the normal amount of the punishment required, yet Iki hasn't break. He survived it, just like Christ survived the flagellation and the mocking by Pontius Pilato and the Roman soldiers, as Antonello da Messina shows us in this breathtaking version of Christ at the Column. Iki, of course, is not Christ. However, he perceives himself as such, or at least as a version of it. He perceives himself as the God of his own story. There are a few moments in the show that are consolidating this belief, and this is definitely one of them. In this situation, Iki should be humiliated, should feel like a ruined man, ashamed, but what we see on his face here is almost a disbelief and marvel at his own new condition. This shot in particular reads like he's having a revelation, and if not a religious one, at least a mystical one. For Iki, this is the proof that he's strong enough to overcome the trials set on his path, just like Christ overcame his own. Moreover, Christ was also flogged in front of Pilato, just like Iki has been flogged in front of Crozier in this scene, which is yet just another confirmation for him. Visually, the two images are also very similar. They both use warm tones, and the focus is both on the characters' facial expressions. Even if we'd have no idea who these two men were, we could still tell just by looking at these two images that they had just suffered a great pain, probably a physical one. In Christ's case, Antonello makes it obvious by depicting him wearing the crown of thorns, the rope around his neck, and a suffering expression. In Icky's case, there is no visible blood, but is covered in sweat, and we can almost see him panting. His lips are parted, his eyes full of tears. However, he doesn't shed them, never. He keeps an overly confident, almost mocking behavior even now, even half naked and beaten to blood in front of his superiors. He should feel ashamed, should repent of what he did to get such a harsh punishment, but he doesn't. Instead, he's proud of himself, and we see it in the fact that he looks at Cruiser straight in the eye during the lashing and after, standing straight in front of him, even in such a state of undress and inferiority. Lastly, having survived this experience with so many witnesses is yet another source of pride for Icky. It's him stating that he won't bend to anyone but himself, and that he is strong enough to survive everything that may get laid on his path. If Icky thinks himself Christ but is not, then Fitzjames doesn't think himself as Christ but is presented as a version of it. There are hints to it in multiple points throughout the show. The most obvious one being Fitzjames exhaling, "I am not Christ," on his deathbed, with blood spilling along his hairline like the wounds left from the crown of thorns on Christ's forehead. And we can count this moment among them. This scene is from episode 8, close to Fitzjames' end, a fact that he himself realizes in this very moment. He already knew he was severely sick at this point, but this is the ultimate confirmation of it. It's him really taking in the state of his body and realizing that there is not much that can be done about it anymore. In this shot, Fitzjames is examining the twin wounds on his arm and on his ribcage, where he got shot years earlier, prior to the expedition, which are reopening now thanks to scurvy, malnutrition, and lead poisoning. We already know at this point that he has these wounds, but this is the first time we actually see them, and the way the scene is presented can be read as a reference to Christ and his own sacred wounds. Fitzjames's basketball wound on the left side of his ribcage echoes the one on the right side of Christ's ribcage. To be more precise, however, nowhere in the Gospels is clearly stated on which side of Christ's ribcage the wound was. So it could also very well have been on the left side, just like Fitzjames. Moreover, we know that Christ got that particular wound on the cross when he was pierced by the lance of Longinus, who was checking he was still alive. We perceive this scene as an omen to Fitzjames' imminent future because of that. Caravaggio's of St. Thomas is a perfect visual comparison for this scene. In both images, there is someone analyzing a wound on someone's ribcage and a tense atmosphere. Christ is with Thomas and two other apostles, probably Peter and John the Evangelist, while Fitzjames is on his own. The incredulity of a second party is therefore here moved to Fitzjames himself, who at the same time becomes the bearer and the beholder of the wound, which are not just wounds, but a symbol of holiness, endurance, and being a victim. Both scenes are also present a pyramidal construction. Caravaggio places St. Peter's head at the highest point of this triangle of this pyramidal construction, while in the scene from the show, the geometric shape is made obvious by the lines of the tent structure, framing Fitzjames and making him the only possible point our gaze goes to. Moreover, our point of view is lower than normal here, making Fitzjames' body appear larger, his pale torso or more almost bright against the muddy colors of the background. Lastly, is turned to the side, presenting us with his wounds, just like a Christ in Pietà presenting his own. All of these details already make the viewer feel invested in the scene, but there is something else that helps us perceive this moment as emotionally taxing, which is the piece of furniture placed on the right side of the shot, which is a visual trick called repoussoir, which means to push away, and it's used in cinema and any other kind of visual representation to make us perceive the distance between us and the subject, pushing us away, and by contrast, pushing us right inside the picture and in the moment itself. The repoussoir is an essential part of this shot. If you cover it, or if you take it out, or if you just cover it with your hand, you will notice how it feels like something's missing. The picture still works, but it feels flat, and our gaze takes longer to reach Fitzjames. It lacks something. It lacks that kind of drama that we have here, that quickness that our gaze reaches him by. By adding a repoussoir, however, we are stuck right into the scene, catapulted alongside Fitzjames and this anxiety and fear. This entire scene is one of the many moments meant to portray Fitzjames not literally as Christ, but as someone who we can connect to Christ in some ways. Fitzjames has changed deeply during the years of the expedition. He has suffered physically and mentally, and most importantly, he has kept a great secret and the consequential pain coming from it, hidden inside of himself for a long time. And he has first confessed it just in the scene prior to this one, basically. However, he still hasn't told anyone about what he knows is going to be his fate, which it should have been kind of obvious at this point. He hasn't told anyone how severely sick, seriously he is. No one knows about that yet. The parallelism with Christ, in my opinion, is meant to underline Fitzjames's character's arc. He started as a vanaglorious young man who was doing everything in his power to constantly be at the center of everyone's attention, and then he slowly ended up stripping himself of all of those masks and fancies that he used to wear all the time. He became the man he has always been underneath that facade, a loyal second and a caring, responsible leader to his men, who he still gives his everything to, even his last dying breath and sacrifice. For the seventh comparison, we still have another kind of parallelism between Christ and Fitzjames. This is from episode 9, and most of episode 9 is about Fitzjames being compared to Christ, starting from this scene where he and the crew are dragging the boat sledges on land. Fitzjames is barely standing on his feet at this point, yet he makes no mention of it and keeps pulling his fair share of weight like everyone else, until it's too late and he ends up collapsing on the ground. The moment he trips and falls and tries to get back to his feet is a clear reference to the moment Christ fell underneath the cross's weight on his way to Calvary. Both him and Fitzjames are walking to the place they are going to die, and if Christ was completely aware of it, by this point Fitzjames was probably also realizing that was going to happen the same to him as well. The scene itself is constructed in a way that makes us think about Christ's death, since it resembles a classic lamentation over the body of Christ iconography. The lamentation is the moment where the Virgin Mary, Saint John the Evangelist, and Mary Magdalene, and sometimes even Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus as well, are grieving the loss of Christ over his body, after having deposited it off the cross on the Golgotha. It's one of the most well-known and popular iconographies in Christian religion that's been painted from the Middle Ages till today. Its composition has been codified through time, like every other religious scene, so that the public, especially illiterate people back in, for example, Middle Age or centuries ago, could easily recognize it by sight only. The orientation of a lamentation scene is usually horizontal. For example, like these ones, presenting the pale dead body of Christ and the eventual tomb in the foreground. The terror, which is shot in a 16:9 aspect ratio, uses this format to its own advantage here. Fitzjames occupies the middle of the frame. Let's get back to this one. He occupies the middle of the frame, with the other three characters reaching for him from all sides. Crozier from the right, from our right, Leviscount from the left, and Bridgens from behind him. It both looks like they are helping Fitzjames to his feet again and helping him to lay down too, like in a deposition from the cross scene, which is the moment that precedes the lamentation. Moreover, it almost looks like Bridgens is either holding Fitzjames' body or is about to pull him across his lap, like the Virgin Mary will do with Christ in a Pietà piece, which is basically a lamentation but only presenting the Virgin Mary and Christ. If we compare this moment with other lamentations, such as the one by Beato Angelico that I decided to use as a comparison here, we can notice that the composition is very similar in both of them. Sometimes Christ's body is laying completely horizontal, sometimes it's being held up by one of the characters or by all of them, but in every single case, the composition creates a triangular shape, with Christ in the center of it. This both has a symbolic meaning, like this as well. This has a symbolic meaning because it represents the Holy Trinity in Christian iconography and religion. But it's also a trick to direct our gaze where the artist wanted to go, on Christ's body, moving from his feet, usually all the way up to his face, so that the viewer can fully take in his wounds and lifeless figure. The scene from the show is built exactly like this. Fitzjames is in the triangular shape that he and Bridgens create together, and that has Bridgens' head as the higher part of it. The rest of the composition strengthens the perception. The lines from Leviscount and Crozier's bodies leaning toward Fitzjames echo the line of the sides of the triangle. And the empty space between their bodies and Fitzjames's body both work in framing his figure and pushing our gaze from his body up to his face. Even the characters' gazes help in bringing our own eyes, like this, our own eyes there to the focus of the picture, which is Fitzjames's face, because they act like invisible arrows to Fitzjames's shocked face, frowning in pain and fear. There is no need for a repoussoir here to make us feel like we are part of the scene, because we are so invested in the moment that we end up sharing Leviscount, Bridgens, and Crozier's positions and roles. We too are standing in front of Fitzjames. We too are worried, sick about what is happening to him, and we too are reaching out to help him, just like the other three men are doing. So basically, we become another character of this scene, and we are standing at the other side of Fitzjames, opposite to Bridgens. So we are basically part of this lamentation. We become another character of the scene. And this is the death scene of Fitzjames. That scene is not only heartbreakingly intimate, but it also exudes a sense of sacredness as well. It echoes a classic deposition from the cross or an entombment scene, where the body of Christ is surrounded by the Virgin Mary, Mary Magdalene, and John the Evangelist, and again, sometimes even Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, maybe even some other characters at times. After having been removed from the cross into the ground. In the entombment scenes, Christ is being laid into his grave, just like in this artwork by Caravaggio. The photograph by Aidan Monaghan, I hope I'm pronouncing the name right, sorry if I'm not, captures the stillness of imminent death and the deep sorrows that the characters involved are experiencing. We as viewers are kept out of this scene, the one from the show. There is a distance between us and the characters in both the photograph and the artwork, like a glass wall placed between us and them and the characters, inevitably dividing our spaces. The characters are so focused on each other that our presence doesn't even get acknowledged. They're too taken in their own despair to spare us a glance. No one looks at us. And there is no repertoire that pushes us into the scene time. There is nothing that makes us an active part of it. However, we're not exactly voyeurs either, as we were in the very first comparison we saw, the one with Fitzjames and Sassoferrato. This time, we are called to behold this tragedy that's happening in front of our eyes, and we become witness of it. It's like the characters are keeping us outside of the moment, but we still have to watch and look what's happening, because it feels like just like a scene from Price's life. We become witness, so it's as if in the future we will be almost called to tell what we saw, or like testify what we saw. Of course, this is the exact moment that precedes a tragedy. We know that that's going to happen, and yeah, so we are basically called to watch it and not forgive it. And the two images have a few other points in common as well. They both use the same word tones and art light and shadow contrast, very harsh chiaroscuro, which was typical of Caravaggio. And this picture actually really looks like a Caravaggio paintings for all of this reason. And this makes them, both of the image looks extremely dramatic. They both use natural generic background that doesn't distract our attention from the main event, and they both portray an earth-shattering tragedy, one that has already happened and the other one that is about to happen. Moreover, the other reason why we are not like meant to be part of the event is that everything happens in silence, and there is movement happening in the picture from the terror, but it's just it's actually invisible and is not moving, because it all happens through gazes. Because Bridgens is looking at Crozier. Crozier is looking at the bottle of poison, and Fitzjames's hands together. And Fitzjames is looking at Crozier. So it's basically this dramatic, like triangular or circle of gazes that we follow, and we keep following, because it's the only thing that we can do. There is no means for us to get into the picture and like help them and check if we can do something, you know, about Fitzjames. So the fact that we are kept out of the picture behind this glass, or this metaphorical like glass that divides us, is also meant to make us feel this helplessness that the characters, that Crozier and Bridges and everyone else are also feeling, because there's nothing they can do to prevent what's going to happen. And basically we feel the same just because of how this picture is created and constructed. And this is again the death scene. Again, episode 9, and Fitzjames whispers, "I am not Christ," while droplets of blood are spilling from the wounds on his forehead, mirroring the droplets of blood on Christ's forehead, spilled from the wounds left by the crown of thorns, of course. There are many depositions and Pietà artworks that could have been used as a parallelism for this moment, but Roger van den Weyden's Deposition of Christ from the Cross is a very unforgiving depiction of pain and death, just like James's last scene is, and this is why I chose it for a comparison, also because obviously the inclination of their heads is basically the same one. The two characters are both portrayed as men, not heroes or powerful messiahs. Fitzjames has blood all over his face. His lips are cracked, the skin broken, and is wearing a shirt that we can tell almost how filthy with blood and sweat is. So he's not the shiny, handsome commander that he was at the beginning of the show anymore, but a dying man who's begging the person the closest to through the expedition to put an end to his sufferings and sacrifice his body to feed and help their men. Van der Weyden does something similar. Flemish painters used to depict their subjects as realistically as possible. So here we have the fainted Virgin Mary being as pale as a sheet because of the horror she just witnessed, and Christ with spilled blood all over his face and his body all limp because it's lifeless, and is what is being taken down the cross. So it's very unforgiving. There is no embellishment in the picture, just as there is none in the show, in the death scene from the show. Fitzjames has no strength, no reason left to hide his extremely human private version of himself, and Christ never did it in the first place because he knew he was acting for a big rightful cause, of course. It's not the last, but it's the most powerful of the parallelisms between them that's presented in the show. It's the one that the creators of the terror wanted to be easily catched by as many people as possible, even those who may not be familiar with the Gospels or Christian iconography or Christian religion. Fitzjames whispering, "I am not Christ," and "my body, use it, feed the man," before dying sounds very much like Christ saying, "This is my body given for you, do this in remembrance of me," when he shared the bread during the Last Supper for the apostles to dine with. It's an easy enough reference for anyone to get, making the public connect the man who sacrificed himself for our sin with the man who, like Mary Magdalene, had a life-revealing experience that made him abandon his many masks, becoming the man he has always been underneath in the first place. For the last comparison that I have is also from the last episode of the show, so from episode 10. There is a wasteland standing before us. There are no people inside, no human figure, and no life at all. Everything looks, if not dead, at least lifeless, then lifeless. A perception strengthened by the absence of warm colors, which is what we usually associate with life, thanks to the sun, sunlight, and nature with a green color, the green colors. The scene is made of cold tones, especially cold grays, which we tend to associate with things that we perceive as dead and inhospitable, like rocks and concrete. Even the sunlight is cold, washing everything into a silent, deadly stillness. This shot is from the last episode of the series, as I said, when everything has already been said and done, this moment especially. Crozier is the only one who survived Tumbak's attack, and is now looking for his man with Selna, but everyone has died or disappeared, and everything he finds in the end is death and desolation, which is what this scene essentially represents. Le Radeau de la Méduse by Jericho, sorry for my pronunciation again, depicts a similar moment, and it does it with similar tricks, visual tricks. Even the differences between the two images actually carry the same message. So in the artworks, there are way too many people, or at least it looks like it. Upon further examination, we notice that many of these people are actually corpses. This image, which is actually an almost 5x7 gigantic oil painting, it's real life-sized, is a depiction of a real event happened in the present time of the artist. The French naval frigate Méduse ran aground on the 2nd of July 1816, and more than 140 people were set adrift on a raft. On this raft is obviously makeshift, so not the best option. And all but 15 died in the 13 days before their rescue, which is the moment that Jericho has decided to show. Both images depict a horrific situation where people are or have been desperately trying to survive to the best of their capabilities, to the point of committing unspeakable acts. For example, it was said that on the raft of the Medusa, cannibalism happened, as well as obviously in the terror. The landscape is given a great importance in both images, since it's the main reason why the people involved are dying. They have put themselves into it, and now they have to survive the consequences of their choices. The painting by Jericho has much warmer colors than the scene from the show, but they are warm only in name, for the sky, the sea, and the characters don't look healthy or alive, but sick and dead. And the landscape only looks dangerous and almost supernatural, thanks to the contrasting colors that the artist has used, meant to make us feel the danger of the scene instead of the beauty of the place. Both images are also constructed in the exact same way. They both present a bigger pyramidal shape and a smaller one to balance it out. The space in both images is directed by a powerful diagonal line, this powerful diagonal line, which starts from the bottom left corner and goes all the way to the upper part of the picture. For the scene of the terror, the diagonal matches with the side of the tent in the foreground, whilst in the artwork, it starts from the dead man on the bottom left corner and goes all the way to the man wearing the piece of cloth in the upper right part of the painting, which is the emotional focus of the picture, of the scene. Moreover, the line of the horizon is positioned higher than normal in both images, which makes us feel like we are being swallowed by the landscape, making us feel trapped in this tragedy alongside the rest of the characters involved, both on screen, so in Jericho painting, and off screen, so in the terror. So in conclusion, this is also my biography. And in conclusion, we all speak the language of images. Most of us don't even realize it, but we all know how to do it. Some people are fluent in it, some people only know the basics of it, but everyone can understand the meaning of a picture when they see it, as long as the party who has created it and the party who receives it share the same type of knowledge. Images have their own language, just like spoken words. There isn't only one universal language, but many different ones, depending on the culture and the history of the people using it. And it's fundamental that the two parties involved in the transaction, the one who creates an image and the one who receives it, share the same one, the same language. If this isn't the case, the meaning of the image gets lost somewhere in the middle, never mind how brilliant it might be. Sharing the same language is the only possible way to understand each other, therefore understand an image. We, as modern Western post-industrial revolution society, all speak the same visual language, which is the product of centuries of art, history, graphic art, photography, cinema, religious iconography, and especially Christian iconography, and more, that's been accumulated throughout centuries. That's why we all understand the meaning behind the images I have presented here. Because the sender of these messages, the creators of the terror, and the recipient, we, the public, share the same visual conventions and that have shaped our eyes throughout time. Even if some of us may not have gotten all of these references, this is because obviously everyone has a different background, but most of them, and like at least the way the pictures are visually constructed, it makes sense to us, and we know how to do it. And maybe even without understanding the artworks referred to, which are also obviously my own entire interpretation. So I could be entirely wrong about that. So these conventions are unwritten rules that we don't even realize we know and apply and read on a daily basis, so deeply rooted they are in our culture, in our eyes, and in our minds. We have seen an example of this phenomenon in this presentation when we notice how images produced in our culture always have one main point of focus. For example, in the parallelism between, for example, this one, main focus, this one as well, almost all of those, but this is also a very obvious example of that. But this idea of having one main focus in a picture is actually a convention that we have. We are so used to this principle that it makes so much sense, and it makes so much sense to us that we don't even question it. We don't even realize that there might be other cultures who speak a different visual language, who create images with multiple points of focus and at the same time, none at all. In Chinese, as well as many other Asian cultures, art, for example, there is no single point of focus, and the viewer is encouraged in getting lost in the scene and take their time looking at it, using the artwork like an object for their meditation rather than a picture to look at, to admire. Western art is different because the viewer's gaze always gets directed in the exact spot that the artist or the creator of the image wants it to go. Nevertheless, both of these languages are valid. Both of them have people who know how to speak them and people who know how to receive the messages carried in those images, which means these two examples of visual languages are both equally functioning. We simply are used to just one of them. Images and pictures are everywhere, today more than ever, thanks to technology and the media we use to share them. Even if we wanted to escape them, we couldn't, for they are with us at all times. We see them on screens, big screens, small screens, cinema screens, TV screens, phone screens, the screen you are seeing my presentation now, for example, as well as in the streets, on billboards, on public transports, on newspapers and magazines. We are surrounded by images, at work as well as in our free time, when we are our own and when we share our time with someone else. We see them on paper, on backlit screens, and on digital projections. We see images as no one in history has had the chance to do that before. This superabundance of images and the extremely easy way anyone has to access them today has made it such a normal occurrence for us to see them that we don't even notice that we are seeing a picture when we are seeing a picture and when we are looking at a picture. So seeing is something we all do. It's in our DNA, in our nature. We can't not see it. Obviously, if we have no visual impairment, which I'm not speaking of that because I have no rights to talk to that, and also it's something I've never studied, so I'm not the right person to talk about that. Looking at something, however, requires more self-awareness, and it's one step further to seeing. When we look at the picture, we are analyzing it, just like I tried to do in this presentation. It could be said that looking is the active form of seeing. The more we challenge ourselves to look instead of see, the easier it will get, to the point that we don't even notice we're doing it anymore, that we won't even notice that we will be doing it. And it will become second nature to us. And I strongly believe that it's extremely important for everyone to learn how to look at images instead of just seeing them passively, especially today, since we are invaded by images in all areas of our life, and we must learn how to manage this abundance of visual stimuli in order to recognize when an image has a value and when it doesn't. Moreover, learning how to look can make us more aware of our surroundings and of the messages that are poured all over us every single day. It can help us orient ourselves and navigate our daily life by understanding it better. Oftentimes, we don't even realize that our eyes and minds are doing what our eyes and minds are doing when we look at an image or a picture. We don't consciously notice the passages and connections our brain makes when confronted with a picture, since seeing is such a natural process for human beings. After all, as John Berger said, and as I said at the beginning of my presentation, when he wrote, quote, "Seeing comes before words, The child looks and recognizes before it can speak, close the quote or unquote. And so seeing is the easiest thing, something we all do with no exclusion. Images are everywhere and their influence on us is incredibly powerful. By becoming more aware of what kind of influence they have, we can better understand ourselves as well as the world around us. And most importantly, we can get closer to their every meaning, making connections on our own and getting so much joy out of it. Speaking from personal experience. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation. And now I'm hopefully learning how to close these things. Thank you for listening.